am honored and humbled to once again be afforded the privilege to preside over this special session of Wake County Superior Court, which is dedicated to remembering those members of the 10th Judicial District Bar who have, in recent months, gone on to their final reward. I'm certainly pleased to have my fellow elected officials here, including our elected clerk of court of Wake County, Jennifer Knox, who sits beside me to help to administer the business of this court this afternoon. I thank my judicial colleagues and fellow members of the bar for their collective presence. Appreciation is also expressed for the astute and sensitive recognition of the local bar to establish a memorials committee, and for this committee in turn to develop such a meaningful program as this one today, which is planned and presented at designated times in order to pay deserving tribute to our fallen colleagues in the law. I'm grateful for the faith and confidence of Senior Resident Superior Court Judge Donald Stevens to entrust this important court session to my care, and thankful to the 10th Judicial District Bar for continuing to welcome my participation. Finally, and most of all, I thank on behalf of all of us associated with the enforcement, practice, application, and administration of the law in our great county, the family members, loved ones, and friends who have allowed us to utilize this occasion to celebrate and commemorate the lives of those who we remember today who have recently left us, as we fondly admire them and keep them in our minds and in our hearts. At this time, the court recognizes the president of the 10th Judicial District Bar, Brian Beverly, to facilitate the duration of the program.
Thank you, Your Honor. May it please the court. Good afternoon. My name is Brian Beverly. I have the privilege to serve as the president of the 10th Judicial District Bar. I simply wish to echo Judge Morgan's comments. I truly and sincerely believe that this is one of the most important pieces of business that we undertake every year. And so without further ado, I will introduce to you Mr. Andrew Chaffee, who will shepherd us through the remainder of the program.
Thank you, Your Honor. I'm going to turn my back on you.
Sir.
Mr. President, thank you, members of the bar, and most of all, to all of you who are here today, thank you for allowing us to honor your loved one. We gather at these memorials not to mourn anyone, but to celebrate their lives both within and outside the law, and to perhaps see a different side of them than we know. For those of us who know the person as a family member, to learn a little about them as a professional, and for those of us who knew them as a professional, to learn a little bit about their lives outside the law. Many of us owe some of our progress in our professional careers because we, at some point in our career, rode on the shoulder of giants that came before us. Today, we truly honor 5 legal giants in our field. Our first speaker to speak about George McClintock Anderson is E. Ray Briggs. He is a UNC undergraduate and also a graduate of UNC Law School, and he practiced with Mr. Anderson. At this point, Mr. Briggs.
May it please the court. Let me open a little bit and tell you, I knew George for 50-odd years. We shared office for over 20 years of that time. And so I knew him very, very well. A little bit open about George. He was born in January the 3rd, 1921 in Edgecombe County, near the town of Liggett's. If you ask George where he's from, he said he was from Whitaker's, which was down the road and wasn't much bigger than Liggett's. And I don't even know if they're there now. I hadn't been there in 20 years. But I asked George one time, I said, where did an Eastern North Carolina boy get the name of Mclintock? And he sort of smiled, and he said, lucky, I guess. And so I dropped it, but over the years, I asked him several other times, and I always got the same answer. And I know there's a good story behind all that, but I don't know what it is because he wouldn't talk about it. George served in the Air Force during World War II, and after the war, he went to Wake Forest College, undergraduate, and Wake Forest Law School, the class of 1950. And it's interesting, two of George's very best friends up to the day he died were Earl Purser and Robert Morgan from Lillington, who just died, by the way. They were friends from that time on, and George was graduated from Wake Forest when it was at Wake Forest before it went to Winston-Salem and became a university. George practiced law for over 60 years, and that included the years that he was the district attorney for the Eastern District of North Carolina. And he was appointed to that position by Judge Carter in 1977. George was also a longtime member of the First Presbyterian Church up the street and was an elder in that church and did a lot of work in the church. He was one of the organizers, I was told, of the Wednesday morning breakfast that a bunch of lawyers went to every Wednesday morning regularly. I didn't go regularly, but I went enough to, and it turned out then it got to be a breakfast for a lot of other people, and it was a fine thing. George was also instrumental in helping organize the Academy of Wake County Criminal Trial Lawyers. George was married to his wife, Frances, for 59 years. They raised three very handsome, good-looking daughters, Paige, Pam, and Cheryl. George was a very friendly person, outgoing. He loved to talk, and he'd never met a stranger, because if he met somebody he didn't know, he'd stop and talk to him and introduce himself, carry on a conversation. You couldn't walk down the street with him without him stopping sometime. And back in the 60s and early 70s, you walked down Federal Street, you'd run into people that you knew, and you'd stop and pass the time of day. I don't know if that still happened because I hadn't been on Federal Street lately. George liked to play practical jokes. I cannot tell you, but I saw it any number of times. Earl Purser would walk into the courthouse and he'd go to an anteroom, take his hat off and lay it down. He'd come back and look for it, it'd be gone, because George had hid it. I mean, I saw it, I can't tell you how many times. And Earl always knew who did it. He'd go hunting George. George was, I don't know what you're talking about. Yeah, go on. But they were good friends, and they argued full time. And on that vein, let me tell you, about less than 6 months, probably 3 months before Earl died, I picked George up from Magnolia Glen, where he was living, went out to the hospital to visit with Earl, and had a great visit. We were there probably an hour. Earl was sitting up. I mean, he wasn't dying at the time, but he had some medical problems, and we were there for over an hour. And half of that hour, George and Earl were arguing with each other about nothing. They just argued because and George loved Earl and Earl loved George. George was a very neat dresser. I mean, he always was very neat, pants pressed. He loved to buy clothes, and he didn't buy inexpensive clothes either. Back in the 60s and the 70s, we'd go up to one of these stores on Federal Street. He'd buy Hickey Freeman suits, and at the time and maybe now, I don't know, but that was top of the line. It cost you a suit, cost you $250, and I don't know what it costs now because I hadn't bought one lately. And I often wonder now, he's spending all this money and he's got those 3 girls at home. But I tell you, he never let them not be dressed in the finest there ever was. They had everything that they could possibly want in the way of clothes. I mean, George had no hobbies that I ever found out or knew anything about. And I concluded after some years of that his hobby was his family. That's where he was focused on other than the practice of law. And they went just about hand in hand, to tell you the truth. He pretended to fish a little bit once in a while if he was at the coast. He never played golf. And so I finally decided his hobby was his family. And he never veered from that. As I said, he was a neat dresser. Once in a while, we'd come to the office on Saturday morning, mainly if you thought somebody might be going to bring you some money. I'd show up in an open neck shirt and tennis shoes and blue jeans. George always had on a tie, wore a tie all the time. The only other person I know of that does that is R.L. McMillan, and y'all probably know there may be many of them. But I hiked the Appalachian Trail with R.L. McMillan for 17 years. He wore a tie every day. And George was like that. He always wore a tie. Now, George was a big Wake Forest fan. And of course, I was at UNC, and we had lots of discussions. Sometimes they would escalate up to arguments. But if on a rare occasion that Wake Forest would beat Carolina in basketball or football, George would call me at home, just crowing up a storm, just raising sand. And I always quoted back to him a lawyer named, I always called him Mr. Clem Holden. He was a lot older than me, and he's older than George. He quoted one time, we were sitting at what was then Honorees over here, was a little snack bar in the morning, about 15 lawyers sitting around on Monday morning, when Wake Forest had beat Carolina in football on Saturday. Clem walked through, and we were all sitting there agonizing, the Carolina fans at Wake Forest. Mr. Clem said, fellas, y'all sitting there worrying about something that don't matter. Said, if you beat the bastard, you ain't done nothing. I quoted that to George every time he called me, and he called me 100 times. And then we would argue. It wasn't a discussion anymore. George liked to play practical jokes. I mentioned he'd hide Earl's hat all the time. He and I were trying a rape case. It was about 68 or 69. Friday afternoon, the jury was out. Judge Bickett was a judge, and Judge Bickett had gotten in some age on him at that time, and his eyesight was not too good. The courtroom was in the old BB&T building when they were building that building there. In the back of the courtroom was a clock. Well, Judge Bickett couldn't see the clock, and he rolled up a piece of paper like an eyeglass, and he'd look through it all during the trial, and he'd look through it. Well, the jury was out, and he was off the bench, and while he was in chambers, George went up there and rolled up a piece of paper real tight and put it in that little wound-up thing. Well, they called the jury, but the jury called and said they had a question, so they brought him back, and Judge Bickett came out, and he picked up his thing, and he was looking at it. And he couldn't see it, really. And he kept looking at it. And, of course, George and I were laughing. He never figured it out, and he didn't catch George either, but he would do stuff like that. I tell you, George was a good friend to me, and a lot of other young lawyers. I would say he taught me how to practice law, and some of you people would say, well, he didn't do a very good job, and that may be true. I don't know, but anyway, he taught me how to interview clients, and the most important thing, he taught me how to set a fee, and believe me, he knew how to set a fee. And so he was not only good to me, he always had time for other young lawyers if you had a question, or particularly if you were around the courthouse and you're getting ready to try a case and stop and ask George a minute. He took the time to talk to you and try to help you out with what you were doing. And I was just one of many that he did that for. George was just a good friend to me and lots of other people. George liked to cook. He'd have cookouts at home. Let me tell this one quick story, and this is people that you knew George, you would know what I'm talking about. he had a friend that was the head of the public service center, public service gas company. They had a big kitchen downstairs in that building on Hillsborough Street. Well, back in the spring for, I know, 10 years or more, they had a Sunday morning breakfast when the shad would run. They'd have fish fry. And George just loved that. I mean, he was circulating around, had his apron on with pockets, and of course there was plenty to drink there at 7 o'clock in the morning. And he would talk to everybody, and you would think he was the cook. Of course, he didn't do any cooking at all, but he wanted to know he was responsible for this fish fry here on Sunday morning. In closing, just let me say that George Anderson was not only a good friend to me and many, many other people, but he was a damn good lawyer. I'm going to tell you, he was a good lawyer and a good citizen. Now, in closing, let me, and I don't want to step any toes here, but I'm bound to say this. George, it's an editorial really. George was a member of a generation that most all of those people were in World War II and survived. And brother, I don't want to step on any toes, but Bo's going to talk about Wright Dixon in a minute, and Wright would be one of the people that I would mention. Well, Earl Purcell is in that group, and R.L. McMillan. R.L. McMillan, they were great citizens, great lawyers, would help their fellow man. Howard Manning, Charlie Fulton, Stanley Seligson would be in that crowd. I'm leaving out people, but I hope you understand that generation was just different than my generation and what's coming along now here, in my opinion. But I would say that Wake County, the 10th Judicial Bar, and Raleigh was well served to have George Anderson and those folks in his generation. I thank you.
Our next speaker is Ralph Bo McDonald. He's well able to speak about our next honoree, Wright Tracy Dixon Jr. as his law partner. Mr. McDonald also is an undergrad and law school graduate of the University of North Carolina. Mr. McDonald.
Wright Dixon, there's a lot of material here. I could spend my minutes reciting his accomplishments and contributions, and there were a lot of them. He was president of the state bar. He was president of this association. He received the Joseph Branch Professionalism Award, which is this association's highest honor, and a symbol of the respect and affection his peers had for him. He served, as Ray mentioned, he served in the Marine Corps in World War II. He spent years on the Raleigh Board of Adjustments, which was truly a thankless job. He was the head of numerous civic associations, and he was a stalwart of St. Michael's Church. But I'd rather talk about what I knew of him. He was a good friend, he was fun to be with, and he was an all-around good guy. The term has become almost trite, but he was a member of the greatest generation. And he had possessed all the characteristics we associate with that dwindling group. I understand there are now 700,000 left out of 16 million originally. Wright loved people. He was always glad to see you and call you by name, if he could remember it. And if he couldn't, somebody else's. He would light up when he saw you, especially if you were a pretty woman. Carson Carmichael, David Coates, and I used to visit him from time to time when he was spending his last years at Springmore and take him to lunch. On one luncheon outing, Carson stayed with him at the entrance to the restaurant while we went to get the car. An attractive young mother walked by with her daughter. And Wright, who was 92 and 93 years old and wheelchair bound, politely said to the mother, "My, you have an attractive daughter," and without missing a beat, "And the mom ain't bad either." He could be gruff, blunt, irreverent, profane, but he was always direct. As an example of this, at his funeral, which was standing room only and a joyful event, the priest told a story that typified his directness. When the priest went to visit Wright in his last illness, Wright looked up and said, "I don't know your name, but you're the one I like." He had an unusually wide range of interests. I'll recite some of them: barbershop, shop, harmony, singing in the church choir, dancing. I think he was second only to Judge Franklin Dupree in dancing renown among the bar. Some of the young people might not catch that one, but woodworking, outdoor activities and sports, notably the Will Turner Hiking Club, which Ray Briggs referred to, a group of good friends, lawyers, who went hiking on segments of the Appalachian Trail. He liked to read military history. He played the piano, taking lessons when he was in his 70s. He wrote 2 books. One was a biographical history, I guess you'd call it, about Civil War experiences of his ancestor, Ben Dixon, who later served as state auditor. Frankly, I think you would need to be a close relation to enjoy this book. And probably not even then. The second one was a novel. It was entitled Twilight and Ten Sin. It was based, at least geographically, on his experiences in China in the Marine Corps. He wrote it under the nom de plume David DeSanto. He never did explain where he got that name, but the book was quite good, surprisingly good, I'll say. He was born on October 7, 1921 in Raleigh. He lived in Hayes Barton growing up. He eventually settled with his family in Drury Hills, and he died a resident of Springmore on November 22nd, 1914. He was 93 at the time, and I haven't researched it, but I think he might have been the oldest member of the bar, this bar, at that time. If he wasn't, he was certainly close to it. Before going any further, I want to recognize his children, Prince, Wright III, and Bill, who are here, and 4 of their 8 collective grandchildren. As many of you know, probably know, his wife was Prince, who he was married to for 60 years, died in 2010. Wright was a son of a lawyer, the original Wright T. Wright went to Carolina Law School after the war. He had gone to Duke undergraduate, so he never learned how to properly spell Duke. Wright and Ruffin Bailey formed Bailey and Dixon in 1956. Ken Wooten joined them soon after, and others came along later. That original trio, with their various eccentricities, would make a good subject for his 3rd book. I don't have time to reminisce with you about all that here today, but I've enjoyed doing so privately in preparing these remarks. Wright loved trial work, the competition, the rough and tumble, and the camaraderie of the bar. And I'm pretty sure that he believed that those who practiced the profession in areas other than the courtroom were not real lawyers. I want to mention 2 of his reported cases, both from the early 60s, which tell us something about his approach to lawyering. The first was an automobile plaintiff's case. The jury came back in, handed their verdict to the bailiff. Before the bailiff could hand it up to the judge, Wright jumped up and said, "I want to take a non-suit." Denied, and the verdict was no negligence. Wright gave notice of appeal. Later in that same term, Judge Leo Carr vacated his own judgment and vacated the judgment. Then the defendants appealed, and the Supreme Court ruled that Wright had the right to withdraw his suit before the verdict was accepted by the court, and the case had ended when he did so. This case demonstrates to me his competitiveness, his quickness on his feet, and his love of the game. I don't know whatever happened on the retrial or settlement of that case. The second, Wright sued the manager of the Raleigh Caps baseball team, the manager, the corporate owner of the team. Let me start again. He sued the manager of the Raleigh Caps baseball team, the corporate owner, and an individual assailant who hit the umpire after the game ended. His theory was that the manager incited the crowd by his on-the-field responses to several controversial calls, and that the club was liable under respondeat superior. Default judgment was entered as to the individual assailant, and I assume he was judgment-proof. And of course, the demurral was sustained as to the manager and the corporate owner of the team. Wright appealed, and the Supreme Court affirmed, but it appears they enjoyed the case. Justice Susie Sharp wrote the opinion and included an interesting but totally unnecessary riff on umpires. I don't know how that came. This case demonstrates to me that Wright never saw a case he didn't think he could win. Now, to present a balanced picture, I need to comment briefly on some of his shortcomings. He was, shall we say, fiscally conservative. He drank some of the cheapest scotch money could buy. And for years, he bought his cars at state property auctions. His political views, I won't even go there. He was not easy for a young lawyer to walk with. His typical instruction was, go find me a case that says, and he was also a frustrated engineer. He had a set of toy cars he would use to demonstrate the physics of a wreck, accompanied by indecipherable references to vectors. He was a terrible driver, and this was principally due to tailgating, lane-changing aggressiveness. As he aged and his reflexes slowed, his bad habits caught up with him. In his last years, he totaled 2 cars within a year. Fortunately, nobody was hurt, and of course, he sued in both instances. And of course, accidents were determined to be either his fault or at least not the fault of the other driver. Although he never said so, I suspect Wright thought Alan Miles and David Coates, who were drafted in to represent him, had not done so effectively. By the way, driving didn't get any better when he moved to Springmore. He got an electric scooter to get around the building, the type they have in grocery stores, and he ran over a lady's foot. There was no injury, but they grounded him. There was no contrition either, because in his view, it was her fault. In summary, Wright had an exemplary career as a lawyer, and like Ted Williams, he ended it with a home run in his last at-bat. Howard Manning had beaten him like a drum in several encounters over the years, but in the last case he ever tried, Wright beat him soundly.
Our next speaker is Ken Eagle. He's going to tell us about someone he practiced with, William Billy Harold Collier. Mr. Eagle also is both undergrad and law school graduate of UNC and a Morehead Scholar.
Your Honor. Ladies and gentlemen, I am honored to be here today to tell you a little bit about my friend, Billy Collier. William Harold Collier, known to his friends and family as Billy. It was a year ago yesterday that his family and his friends learned of his very untimely death at the age of 57. Billy died at home peacefully in his sleep, and it's been quite an ordeal for a lot of us since then, just kind of coming to grips with that. Billy was born and raised in Durham, and he was a graduate of East Carolina University and of Campbell University School of Law. And he set up a practice in Cary in the mid-'80s. Toward the end of the 80s, early 90s, I was looking to set up an office in Cary, and a friend of mine for whom Billy worked in Salisbury, where I had moved from, said, I have a fellow working for me in Cary, and I think we've got an extra office, and why don't you just go set up in there? And I said, well, fine. Maybe I better go talk with your employee who's there and make sure it was okay. Well, right away, Billy was very welcoming, no problems with me being there, which I'm not sure what that means, because a lot of people would have a problem with me being there, but not Billy. Billy and I hit it off right away. I don't know if it was because of our mutual interest as Tar Heel fans. That certainly helped. It could have been our mutual interest in the best hamburger place that we've ever had around here, in my opinion, called Fat Daddy's, which we missed dearly. We were there for the last day. Make sure we didn't miss that. Or it could have been just because Billy was such a great person and such a caring and kind person, always willing to help, always willing to do something for you. If I ever had any doubts about Billy, it was quickly dispelled, because my wife, who is one of the most perceptive people I know when it comes to assessing a person's character, immediately liked Billy. And I knew right away if that was the case, I'd never have a problem with him, and we never did have a problem. We spent many, many nights in front of that TV, telling first Dean Smith and then Roy Williams what fools they were. Of course, we were the fools, obviously. We were wrong most of the time, but it didn't stop us from doing that. Those of you who practice in these courtrooms, you probably don't know Billy and wouldn't have known Billy, because there's a few of you in here who would, because I see some fellow dirt lawyers in here, and that's what Billy was. He was a dirt lawyer. He was a real estate guy, and even beyond that, he was really in the trenches, because primarily he did residential real estate and did residential real estate closings. And any of you who have ever done that at any point in your career know how much patience that takes and how much perseverance that takes. It's a challenge, and it's gotten increasingly challenging over the years. But Billy, he did other things as well, and occasionally, as I see his brother out there, I'm sure he could tell us, occasionally Billy would have to go to court to take care of various speeding tickets and things like that. And he was willing to do that, even though that was not his thing. But if it was a family member or a friend of his, he was right there. I can't begin to tell you how much money that man probably saved me over the years coming over to my house and repairing things. No matter what it was, whether he knew how to do it or not. He would take it on, and most of the time, he would get it done. Now, grant you, you wouldn't want to put a set of instructions down there for him to look at, because that'd be a total waste of time. But he grew up, his father was a builder, and he learned early on how to do things. And he was very handy. And again, he was just always willing. And my wife, God bless her, she would feed him every time he came over. So he liked that. And we spent a lot of enjoyable minutes together. And I just miss him every day. I was speaking to a client of his a couple of weeks ago, and he told me he just stood there and shook his head, and he said, I just don't know what to do. He said, I don't know what to do without Billy. And I know those of his family members who are here today, and I know myself, we feel the same way. It was a number of months after his death before I deleted his cell phone number from my telephone, because there were so many days that I would pick up my phone and start to call him. And, you know, it just, so it took me a while. He, in addition to being a jack of all trades, in addition to being a big sports fan, he was also a big Redskins fan. That's probably another reason we hit it off early on. He didn't really participate in sports to speak of. If I would mention golf, he would almost go screaming out of the room, which was my favorite thing to do. But he did like to play ping pong, and he spent a lot of time in his spare time doing that in Morrisville at one of the facilities there. And I can remember him telling me about some of his lessons. They have a couple of people out there who actually participated in an Olympics in ping pong, and he was taking lessons from one of them, and he would tell me how she would just be running him all over the place, and he'd be huffing and puffing and sweating, and she'd be standing there saying, "You too fat, run, you know." And so it was, again, he had a lot of patience to do that as well. As you've heard about some of the other people today, you know, about Wright Dixon, I heard him say he was very frugal. Well, Billy would have given Wright a run for his money, I think, in that respect, because Billy was quite frugal as well, and he loved to bargain. And as his brother can attest, us spending time in his office over the past few months cleaning things out, you could tell that if he found something that was a bargain on eBay, it was probably there in that office and in multiple quantities. Some of the things we didn't even know what they were. He loved electronics. He loved computer games. And I've concluded as our first speaker, I think, you know, if he had a hobby outside of playing ping pong and maybe playing some video games and representing his clients, which he did diligently and very well for a number of years, I think it was his family. Because I know a number of occasions when I would call him and say, well, you know, can you come over for dinner tonight, or what are you doing? He'd say, well, no, you know, my brother and sister, we're going out to dinner tonight. And I said, well, I understand, that's fine. We'll do that another time. So he is survived by two sisters and a brother and a number of cousins and nieces and nephews. Billy never married. He lived in his family home most of his life, and he took care of his elderly mother when she was you know, going through her last days, and he continued to live there. Commuted over here from Durham every day. It got increasingly more difficult, as all of you know who live around here. But he didn't complain. He showed up all the time, and that's how I knew something was wrong about a year ago, is because he didn't show up to his office one day. And I called over there again, we were going to invite him to dinner that night, and they said, well, we haven't seen or heard from him all day. So we knew that was a problem, and one thing led to another, and we found that he had passed away. So Billy, to sum it up, he was a very caring person. He was willing to give you his time and attention. And for me, especially most of all, he was my dear friend, and I still miss him every day. Thank you.
Carrying forward our real estate theme, our next tribute is to Larry A. Outlaw. To tell us about Mr. Outlaw is someone with whom he worked at the North Carolina Real Estate Commission, Mel Black, who I think we'll learn was inspired to go to law school in part after attending Appalachian State. Mr. Black.
Larry Outlaw meant so much to so many. As Andrew said earlier today, he was a giant in the law. and I was only one of many who rode his shoulders. He was born in 1944. He was from the thriving metropolis of Botankus in Duplin County. For those of you who don't know where that is, when you're going real fast to the beach on I-40, about halfway, just hang a left. He graduated from Davison, went to law school at UNC Chapel Hill, and I've learned just today that while at UNC Chapel Hill in the summers, he served as an assistant policeman in Virginia Beach. I think I've just heard that. He was a captain in the Army, worked in the North Carolina community colleges. Then he found a home at the North Carolina Real Estate Commission, where he stayed for 35 years until his retirement in January of 2014. And I'm very happy to say, is following his retirement, after a forced month off, he came to work with me in private practice, and we had a great time. Larry died suddenly from a heart attack last July, and we lost someone who made the world a better place. And like you, I had a very hard time on a day-to-day basis not picking up that phone and giving Larry a call or seeing him come to my office or us have a chat. He meant so much to his family. I was working with him when he cared for his mother in her final days, and if there's a better son, I don't know who it would have been. He's loved his wife Deborah, who's here, embraced Mary Beth, Mike, and Elizabeth. He's taken care of his extended family for years, support, help, advice, fixing things, or taking a day off just to give somebody a ride to the doctor's office. Larry was always there for everybody. He meant so much to the real estate community, not only in North Carolina, but nationwide. He was elected president of a national association. He developed processes that are used in other states. He's written multiple books, co-authored multiple books that are used in real estate classes. He's an amazing writer, amazing legal writer, very precise, very detailed, and it's shocking how much material he can crank out in such a little time. We would leave the office some afternoons at 5 or 6 in the afternoon. He would come back in about 10 o'clock, cigarettes in one hand, bag of ham biscuits in the other, almost every day. And he had written so much the night before, and I'm going, how in the world does one guy turn out this much precise, detailed information in that period of time? But he could do it. He was held in such high regard by all that were lucky enough to work with Larry. When he died in January when he retired from his job in 2014, there was an outpouring of appreciation and love. There were parties, there were luncheons, there were gifts, there were speeches. Some of you here made speeches at his retirement. There were photo histories. One of the great speeches included some figurines and a little PowerPoint presentation about how to deal with Larry. It was very well done by someone here who knows him very well, and how to get through that very tough, gruff, huffing exterior to get to the soft, lovable human he really is and really was. And that's the part that means so much to me and means so much to all of us. At his funeral last year, a number of you here were able to speak. And hearing all the things that folks said about him at his retirement and then at his funeral, both formally and then informally chatting, it became clear to me that Larry was not only revered professionally, but he was loved very deeply personally by so many that he worked with, so many that he touched. And in those two settings, I heard one word over and over, and that word was mentor. And so many lawyers, so many folks talked about how Larry helped them, how Larry mentored them, how Larry brought them along. And I'm just one of many that have that same relationship with him and those same experience with him. But if you indulge me for a little bit, I'd like to publicly just talk about my relationship with my friend. I met Larry in 1991. I was interviewing for a job at the Real Estate Commission, and he was one of the interviewers. We had an instant connection. Instant. like we had known each other or been friends for years. He was from the middle of nowhere, eastern North Carolina. I was from the middle of nowhere, western North Carolina. Krause, if anybody knows where that is, I'll be shocked. But we just hit it off and almost communicate, almost without speaking. It was just amazing. Ultimately, I came to work at the Real Estate Commission in 1992 in Larry's department. He was my boss. I was his employee. Before I even started working there, a month or so, when I came in to sign some papers or whatever, he took the afternoon off, took me around Raleigh, showed me around, helped me find an apartment, and showed me places in Raleigh I didn't know existed. After I got to work there, he would invite me out on some social evenings, and I got to see parts of Raleigh I didn't know existed either. Larry trained me up in the way it should be done, and as he's done with so many, taught us how to think, how to analyze, how to take a problem and solve it. He took great glee in his employees and making them pass the broker's exam before he'd let them work with them. And he would tell you, you're going to have to pass this exam. And I see the heads nodding already because I know it happened. And I said, okay, great. Bring it on. When do you want me to take this exam? He goes, today. I went, okay. So I took the exam, and as he's done others, he likes to grade the exam in front of you. He's sitting behind the desk, you're sitting in the chair, and he's making faces at you as he grades the exam. I'm going, this ought to be fun. Well, after I aced the law section of the exam, I got this look that let me know that I was in the right place, and this was going to be a good time. Because you see, I had not gone to law school at that point. Other people in my family had gone down the law school path, and my family had a connection to a particular institution. And by gosh, I was not going to law school. And there is no way I'm going to Winston-Salem and going to school. And I had just decided that. I'm going to go work at the Real Estate Commission. Well, working with Larry kind of changed that. I don't think he had that as a goal, but the way that he treated me and the way that he taught me, he had this magical way of taking this somewhat rebellious, somewhat undisciplined thought and narrowing and focusing my thinking, but at the same time turning me loose to go do what I needed to do. One particular time, and it may have happened more than once, I remember going to Larry's office and fighting my way through the smoke. Those of you who remember government offices, there was smoking in government offices in the 80s, and then in the 90s, there was this little shift where a certain percentage of a government office was deemed the smoking area. Well, the Real Estate Commission solved that by making Larry's office the smoking area. So I would go through Larry's office, go in, and he's at work using a pencil just like this. I've been using them for 3 years now because he got me started, and I've had a box on my desk for 2 decades plus. I see you nodding your head. You've done the same. Larry, there's this issue. There's this thing. There's this problem. And it looks like from this side, and I'm not, he looked up and he would say, what's the rule say? That's all he would say. So I leave, spend a little time, I come back. Hey, Larry, just want to run something by you real quick. Here's the issue. The statute says this. The administrative code says this. The rule applies this. Here's what I was kind of thinking, and I think the commission's position ought to be this. He went, okay, so? And I went, oh, now I got it. And that's the way he trained me. And he also inspired me to go to law school by not trying to get me to go to law school. He never mentioned it. We never talked about it. But I would sit there and we'd have these discussions / arguments, whatever you want to call them. And I just remember looking up at his law license going, you know what? Maybe it's time. So I decided it was time, applied, went to evening school, didn't tell him until I was already finished with 1 semester. A few years later, I had an opportunity to become the head of a state agency. In 1995, I had a chance to become the director of the appraisal board in North Carolina. Larry supported me. helped me, and he wrote a phenomenal reference letter like only he could write. So many pages long, so detailed, so helpful. I read that thing, it strengthened me, it empowered me. It said, I can do this, I can take this on at age 30. And I did, and I was so helpful for his help. And when I got the job, I trained my folks the same way he trained me. Here's the rule, here's the statute, let's go to it. And oh, by the way, there's going to be a test. And so I enjoyed it. We stayed in touch. We stayed in close touch. About 8 years later, in 2003, it was time for Larry to help me again. Like some lawyers in government had been in private practice and then gone into government. I had not. I went to law school while in government, and Larry had gone straight into government without going into private practice. And I had that itch. I had the private practice bug. And my board was going through some political turmoil, as political appointees might do, and it was just not a fun place to be. And so I had a couple of people I wanted to go see, but you know who's on top of the list, right? We took a ride. We went to eat lunch. Can't tell you everything we talked about. But the end of that conversation, it was time. It was time to go for it. It was time to leave the comfort of monthly security in the government to go jump out and hang out the shingle. And I'm so thankful that he helped me and talked me into that. He didn't talk me into it. He knew that I wanted to, but he helped me make that decision. I also learned during that discussion that I got the inkling that Larry had a private practice itch that he hadn't yet scratched. So I kept that in mind. Over the years we visited, as I had cases before the commission, we'd go upstairs, I'd always stop by completely unannounced, come in, we'd sit down, we'd talk. And it was so much fun. We'd catch up on life, family. I would watch the accumulation of golf trophies. He was quite the avid golfer, entered tournaments all over, and there was another trophy or two. He would tell me about his yard work and all the things he had to get done, all the things he was behind on, and what season it was, and what he ought to be doing. And he was always excited about that, or talking about the beach house, or fussing about Chapel Hill athletics as well, or maybe really, really mad about something the Real Estate Commission had just done. But we had these great conversations. And after several years of that, sometime around 2010, he turned to, well, you know, I just don't know what I'm going to do when I retire. Retirement's coming up, and I don't know if I should say this year, that year, and this. Worried. I said, Larry, you have an open door. Whenever you retire, whatever I'm doing, the door's open. Come on. 3 years later, he's actually starting to plan his retirement. He says, Mel, were you serious? And I said, absolutely. Are you kidding me? And I will tell you, we had a glorious time. We had a great time practicing law together. It was so fulfilling to work with him again. I enjoyed that gruff exterior, that facade, that rah, 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 I'm mad about this, I'm mad about that. And we just had the greatest time. He was all worried about his heirs and omissions insurance. I'm coming from government to private practice, what am I going to do? And I've heard from his co-workers at the commission that he actually asked them what to do, and he was all worried about it. So we had a little thing in our office. We were going to add him on, take care of the policy, pay the premium, and we conspired to never tell Larry what the premium was, because he was wanting to pay for it because he didn't want me to have to pay for anything. And we conspired, and he never knew what it was, and he never got to pay me back, and that's just the way it ought to be. We had a long time together. I figured my job in private practice with Larry was to give him a carefree, stress-free, enjoyable time. He had kicked my career off and gave it a good start. It was my turn to do whatever I could to try to give him a nice place to be and to practice when he wanted to. He had a job description, and it was anything you want and nothing you don't. But he started taking cases, and he did great, although I did make him play golf twice a week. But he had a good time. He did a good thing. He was wonderful to practice with. And in every situation, he always looked after me, even when I was trying to look after him. In every way, he looked after me at every spot. After the first year, and it's very private, I won't tell it anyway. December had ended, the year was over, January, we're into February, and he said, Mel, I got a problem I need to talk to you about. Yeah, what is it? He goes, I've been going back through all the cases we've done, and all the work you brought in, all the work I brought in, and what you've paid me, and what the overhead is, and you're paying me too much. I'm a burden on your firm, and I think we need to change this where you pay me less. Folks, raise your hand if you've had a lawyer come to you and say that you're paying me too much. I said, no, Larry, absolutely not. And so that's the kind of man he was. He looked after me at every step, at every place. It was no surprise that he was a wonderful private practice attorney. He handled complex matters with ease. I can remember our first time meeting with a large client, a large brokerage firm. They were trying to make some plans on expanding, going into a different area, and they had these questions, and we made the appointment. I said, by the way, I'll have a new lawyer joining me who just joined our firm. And in walks Larry Outlaw, and they go, what? He's the guy who wrote the book. Is his name? I went, yeah, he wrote the book. And we're in this conversation, we're having this meeting, and he just gets it. He just gets it. It just gets it. And it's like, I've got more to learn. He drafted and filed some masterful responses to complaints. He negotiated deals. He negotiated consent orders. He just did a great job. And in that job, he developed yet another segment of people to whom he meant so much. Just before he passed away, in the last several months, I had made a decision I made without talking to Larry about, because that's the way you do it. All right? If you have the conversation, you got to go through the conversation. All right, we can't do this, we can't do that. Oh, yeah, we can't. You just do it. So I was ready to change the structure of our firm and change the name to Black and Outlaw. Things were underway. Everything was done. We got a new logo in. The B&O Railroad, I think, is closed, so they wouldn't really come after us if we used it. Got a new website. We took Larry out. We had a photo shoot. We told him something else. I forgot what it was about. But we got it all ready. And our goal was to be ready sometime, I don't know, first part of July. So everything was ready, and the website guy said, hey, Mel, how about right after the July 4th holidays? We'll come in, and I'll have the big reveal. And we'll talk to Larry, and when he says, no, don't do that. You don't need to do that for me. It's not about me. It's all about you. Then I can just show him. And as fate would have it, he passed away before I could tell him or show him what we had done. And that's just the way things go. I, like so many of you and so many other lawyers at the commission and so many folks there, owe my career to Larry Outlaw. I think about him all the time, think about him frequently. Those first several months to sit in that office and not have him there were really tough. I cherish the times that we had had. I wish we'd have had more. And I'm thankful for this opportunity. Thank you, Andrew, for setting this up. Thank the bar, Judge Morgan. Thank you for being here, for allowing me to give just a brief glimpse into the hundreds of stories that show how much Larry Outlaw really meant to me. Thank you.
A graduate of Belmont Abbey and UNC Law School, our next speaker, Timothy P. Lehan, is here today to tell us about his law partner, James D. Blount, Jr.
May it please the court, Judge Morgan. Jim Blount was my mentor, my law partner, and my friend. Jim was someone who everybody thinks practiced law only in Raleigh, but that's not true. The reality is that Jim was a statewide lawyer and was recognized as such. It's my honor, and I'm humbled, to tell you a little bit about my friend and law partner, Jim Blount. I want to recognize and introduce to you Jim's loving wife, Linda, His daughter Joy was unable to be here, but her husband Jim is here in her stead. Also, Jim's sons, Davis and Charles, are here. And Jim's stepson, who he always considered to be his third son, Bob. Welcome to you. On behalf of the bar, the community, and Smith Anderson, I want to thank the family for sharing Jim with us. In terms of our practice, it wouldn't be what it is without Jim here. The community greatly benefited from having Jim Blount as one of its members. This is hard for me. It's been a year almost, but it's still hard for me because Jim I loved so much. Charles and Bob were unparalleled in their love of Jim. What I would like to do is tell you a little bit about Jim Blount and who he was. James Davis Blount Jr. was born in Wilson, North Carolina, January 2nd of 1952. He grew up there, excelled in athletics, he loved to debate, and he was an Eagle Scout. He then served our country in the Navy in 1945 and 46, and upon his return, he started his academic career and was a double Tar Heel. I wear my tie in his honor. He finished at UNC in 1950, and in 1952 he finished law school at UNC. Among the honors he had in law school was that he was on the editorial board of the Law Review, he was the chair of the Honor Council, and he was the president of his law fraternity. Jim didn't start in Raleigh. He actually started in Rockingham, North Carolina, and he practiced there for 17 years in a firm that first was Leith and Blount and later became Leith, Bynum, Blount, and Hinson. Jim was very active in Rockingham, as he was wherever he was. He was twice serving on the city council. He was the chairman of the Board of Trustees for Richmond Memorial Hospital. He was the chairman of the board for the library and was selected as Man of the Year for 1956. But he got the itch, and thankfully for our law firm, Smith, Anderson, Blount, Dorset, Mitchell, and Jernigan, Jim Blount in 1970 decided he wanted to move to Raleigh, and he did. Jim Blount stayed with our firm and was active, participating in our firm from 1970 until last October when he passed at the age of 88. Jim's honors were almost too many to mention. He was in the Hall of Fame for the North Carolina Bar Association's general practice area. He was the vice president of the Bar Association for North Carolina and served on its executive committee. He also had honors from national organizations, and he was a permanent member on the Judicial Commission for the Fourth Circuit. But Jim Blount, the measure of the man, was not the accolades, but the attributes that he had, and he had many. First and foremost in those was Jim's love of the law. Jim would tell anybody who would listen that there was never a day that he got up that he did not look forward to going in and practicing law. And we at Smith Anderson knew that to be true because Jim continued to do that until he was 87, enjoying the law every single day. Jim was both a student of the law, but also a teacher of the law. Jim became a litigator by chance. When he joined our firm in 1970, The track that he was on was to become a trust and estate lawyer, a tax lawyer, but never a litigator. Tragically, in 1971, the senior litigator and one of the senior partners, Willis Smith, was killed in a plane crash. Jim inherited on that day 144 active cases, and he learned the law and was a student of the law in defending those cases and the 300 trials that he had in civil litigation. But he also was a teacher of the law, and not just within our law firm by being a mentor and being an example to we young litigators. He taught a whole generation of lawyers in North Carolina. I told you that he practiced in Rockingham and practiced in a firm with the last name of Hinson. Well, that was Robin Hinson from Robinson Bradshaw. And in 1961, he and Jim decided that lawyers needed to have a bar review course well before Barbary. And they taught that course from 1961 to 1979. It was interesting to be with Jim when he met these people who said they owed their law license to the prep that Jim had given them. And Robin and Jim were an interesting pair because Robin was the technician and Jim was the humorist. I have talked to lawyers who said at this point they don't remember all the things that Jim taught them about the law, but they still remember a good number of the jokes that he told. He made something enjoyable that otherwise might only have been bearable. And this worked to his advantage and to the advantage of the younger lawyers in the firm. An example of that was a time that I was with Jim and we were arguing a case and Jim was making a very valid point, but then the plaintiff's lawyer got up and made an equally valid point, and I thought, this is close. And the judge sort of paused a moment and he said, you know, this is a really hard decision for me. Looked at the plaintiff's lawyer and he said, unfortunately for you, the little bit of law I know Jim Blount taught me, so I'm going to have to side with him. I won't tell you who that judge was, but I always loved that because people had that kind of appreciation for him. In addition to his humor, he had great wit. His quick wit was unparalleled. And I hate telling war stories all the time, but another example of that that's told in the firm many times is when Jim was in the firm on a Sunday afternoon preparing for a trial with probably a brown-haired Sammy Thompson. This was so long ago. But the two of them were doing that last run-through you do on the medical records in a medical malpractice case. And Jim broke the silence, saying to Sammy, "Golly, I hope my doctor never puts that in my medical record." And Sammy said, "What's that, Jim?" And Jim was pointing to the record where it said, "Genitalia unremarkable." Jim would want you to laugh. In addition to wit and humor, another attribute of Jim Blount's was his Southern charm. He absolutely mesmerized juries. A couple of examples of that I saw as a young lawyer. When Jim was picking a jury in one of the first cases I tried with him, and someone went into the box that looked like she might be 70, 75 years old, and Jim asked the question, "Did you ever work outside of the home?" And she said, "Lord, yes." Said, "I taught school in the first grade for 45 years. And Jim Blount instinctively said, "God bless you." And I thought at that point, I didn't know how the case was going to turn out, but the best the plaintiff's lawyer was going to do was 11-1 hung jury, because he had already won that lady over with his charm. The other great example that I remember so well was a case that we tried down in Goldsboro. And Ed Preston from the bench here in Wake County was our trial judge. And we had tried it for 3 weeks, and on one of the mornings, the plaintiff's lawyer came in and said, "Your Honor, I want to be heard on the record." And Judge Preston said, "Okay," and we didn't know what it was about. And he stood up and said, "Your Honor, I want to object because that cute young girl at the end of the jury is smiling at Mr. Blount, and she is shaking her head every time he makes a point." And Ed Preston thought for a second, and he said, You know, when we started this trial, I gave you the opportunity to pick the jury you wanted, and I gave Mr. Blount the opportunity to pick the jury he wanted. And if at this point the jury likes Mr. Blount more than they like you, I can't help you. The other great attribute about Jim Blount was, as much as he loved the law, there was so much more to his life than just practicing law. He loved to go out to Mill Burney Fishing Club with his kids, with his grandkids. He loved going flying. He was a licensed pilot. He loved going duck hunting with his many physician friends. One of his favorite experiences in life was a unique one. I'm not sure many of us would ever have this. Linda and Jim were flying to London on the Concorde. And Jim was a pilot, as I mentioned, and Linda said to the stewardess, "I wonder if my husband could go up into the cockpit. You'd never do that today, and you'd never find a Concorde." But they said, sure, he can go up there. So he went up to the cockpit of the Concorde, and they allowed him to sit in the jump seat as that plane landed in Heathrow. And he always remembered that as one of the most joyous times in his life. Jim also had a love for adventure. He parasailed over France. He drove race cars around the Charlotte Motor Speedway. And my favorite, at age 73, went skydiving with younger partners and associates in the firm. Jim loved life, and it loved him. 1 week ago, this very day, Smith, Anderson, Blount, Dorset, Mitchell, and Jernigan turned 104 years old. For 45 of those years, we had Jim Blount as our partner. Smith Anderson is what it is because of Jim, and we thank him.
I'd like to thank all of our speakers and families, members of our committee, those who are here and not here, who have worked to make this happen, our videographer, Brian Miller, Charlotte and Whitney, and the officers of our bar, to your honor, and our clerk and bailiff for bringing this session of court today, and most of all, to all of you for coming. Thank you very much. I'm going to turn this back over to your honor.
Mr. Chiaffi, thank you, and thanks again to the committee and overall the bar for such a tremendous program. Indeed, what a touching and meaningful program we have experienced and shared today, and it's certainly good to look out and see such a full courtroom, because these whom we have honored are certainly deserving of having the kind of crowd that we have here today to share the memories. As we leave this place, let us be inspired by the legacies of those we have saluted today, as well as to be moved to aspire to establish such lofty legacies ourselves. Mr. Bailiff, we're going to be in recess and indeed adjourn. Sine die.
All rise. Oh yes, oh yes, oh yes. The special setting stands adjourned. Sine die. God save the state and this honorable court. Good afternoon, Your Honor.
Good afternoon, and thank you. Thank you all.